All right. So we're going to get right into things. The panel's going to be, it's not insignificant, but I would actually like some chance to, have some questions and comments. First of all, anybody see that Wimbledon game? Because that's obviously why you were watching. Everybody wanted to see tennis. Any Doctor Who fans out there?
Woo! Just looked it.
They announced the new Doctor at the end of the Wimbledon game. Would anyone like to know? All right, the new Doctor is going to be Jodie Whittaker from Broadchurch. So, female Doctor. Cool.
Oh, is that finished?
Yeah. All right, so I want to welcome you guys to the Brony Critic's Guide to Better Fan. No, that was last year. Sorry, I'm a world building. That's what we're doing here today. Now I remember. All right, so what is the purpose of this panel? Oh, let me first get it. Oh, there. All right, so the goal of this panel is I want to be able to provide for you guys a general framework on how and why we world build in fiction. I want to be able to aid, hopeful writers, critics, in determining what type of world building suits you, your needs, as well as your writing style, and for the critics out there, what to look for in good world building. I also kind of want to provide example questions and existing realms for you writers out there to consider when you're creating your world. So let's ask the first question. What is world building? Building worlds, obviously, but world building, in a sense, is the act of elaborating upon a character's environment, history, and culture for the purpose of enhancing the immersion of the audience. You want to try to get the audience invested in the character's world and strengthen the themes that your story is going to be trying to forward, as it were. So it's basically the art of detailing a setting to force your audience to listen to you. Why do we world build? It's a pretty simple, we've asked what, but now it's time for the why, or more accurately, what motivates world building. And I've kind of come up with 4 reasons why we do it. First of all, we want to kind of enhance the details of a world. By world building, a writer can develop a more complex social and cultural structure. When you have more details, you have more content to use. You have a bigger playpen, as it were. You can reintroduce concepts. It can help you to create new ideas. I put in the second, to create a world for a separate project. Some of you guys might want to world build to make videos, or for D&D, especially D&D is really useful to come up with world building. You can answer questions in an established world. I've been writing, haven't technically been writing, but world building my own fan fiction for the last 4 years, and it all started with a single question in the My Little Pony universe, and that has since spiraled out to consume my life. Yeah, you guys think I'm kidding. Let me show you guys my Google Drive this is the part for my Equestrian Cycle Google Drive. The stories right here, that is the appendices, right? Yeah. I have it based down on cultures. I have a timeline of about 13,000 years. That because of the age panel, I'm going to have to completely revamp because I love what she did with age. So back to the drawing board. And as far as appendices go, I have it based on race, on nation. I have the political structures, religion, language.
that much, do you?
This is my getting out.
Let's all be hermits together. Let's all be hermits together. Band of trash. Yes.
In fact, on my way, waiting for the panel, I was messing around with it, waiting for the musicians panel to end. I was still messing around. So, to answer questions, and the last one is to incite mysteries. When you mention a war that happens in the past, but you don't describe it at all, but you keep on hinting at it throughout your story, it makes your audience interested in what's going to happen. They want to know more. They want to figure out more. And if you can especially get it, they might want to answer those questions for themselves, which will get more people creating stuff. And if you're a writer, you really want other people to be inspired to continue writing as well. That really should be the goal of any content creator, is to create other creators. So, world building is going to be a natural part of the narrative process. You're going to do it. Like in any case of writing or D&D building, you're going to world build. So it's probably important to know how to do it well. So how do we start? Right. That really is the simplest way, is just write stuff. Start with an idea, start with a concept. Your story has to come first. Start with the idea, your nugget, your conflict. Build around your idea, and don't build ideas from your world, at least at first. Because as you're building your world, you will come across, I want to explain that more. Oh, that sounds like that's really cool. But at the beginning, start with your idea, start with your question, start with your villain, start with whatever it is motivating you to write your story in the first place. And also, you want to learn from other world builders, because good creators steal often and from the best. That really is a great way of thinking about it.
Imitation is the highest form of flattery.
Imitation is the highest form of flattery. That is absolutely the case. So, if I can give a recommendation, J.R.R. Tolkien, amazing. We have Eric Flint, who probably not a lot of you guys have heard of.
White Rose, 1633.
Yes, finally, somebody who knows that series. All right, so we have George R.R. Martin, who of course is the writer of Game of Thrones and Clash of Kings, and The Reason Your Friends Were Really, Really Sad 10 years ago, and You Were Sad 5. And J.K. Rowling actually is also a really good example of a good, consistent world builder. So, we've talked about where to start. Let's talk about the keys to world building. What should you be thinking about when you're world building? And the answer is questions. Constantly, consistently asking yourself questions. You might start with a rough idea, but if you're wanting to expand your story and find thematic and narrative connections, you're going to start asking questions. How did my character get to this point in their life? What fears and regrets did my character have? What was the culture they were raised under? How does that affect their morality and ethics? How does it affect the villains in their world? Is your world even going to have traditional standard villains? Or are you going to go Game of Thrones route and make everyone a villain? Everyone is a villain in the Game of Thrones universe. There are no heroes.
It's like a grand morality thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, there was one hero. Grey Wind.
I'm guessing he's dead.
The direwolf. The dogs were the only innocent creatures in that whole world. Alright, so. Yep. And the method I tend to use when I'm asking questions is what I call the interview method. It's basically, I separate myself from the character. I basically put my character in front of me and I act like I am a reporter for a news segment. I ask them questions about their life. I want to know, how things are going. What are they doing? What are they thinking right now? What got them to that point? It's a really good way to kind of isolate yourself and to come up with something more original. You kind of want to separate yourself from your character as much as you can. It's not possible to completely do it because your characters are essentially a reflection of yourself, so you're going to notice a lot of things about yourself. But you really do want to separate the two, just so that you can make sure that they are going to be as original and individual as they can, especially when you start introducing other characters. So, there are two types of world building, or at least philosophies of world building. There is the Gartner Model and the Architect Model, and I'll go through both. And these aren't absolutes, they're more extremes on a spectrum. All of you guys, when you write, would fall into somewhere between the two. Some people are going to be more gardeners, some people are going to be more architects. When I describe what they are, you guys will probably be able to tell what you are just from the way it sounds. I'll just say for myself, I am very, very much inclined to the architect model, almost to a fault. Each model has its positives and its negatives, and as you write, you can actually start to develop and push yourself into those directions, but you're going to start and kind of lean towards one model. But it is possible to practice yourself into different ones. So, we're going to start with the Gartner Model. This is the idea the gardener plants initial ideas in an early stage and allows the ideas to kind of develop as they're writing. They trim and they clarify when necessary. This is a really good way to think about this one this is the Lovecraft Model. When Lovecraft was writing, he wrote very much in the moment. He came up with great ideas, but the whole Cthulhu mythos was a thing that was developed as the stories were written. He didn't sit down and plot out what each creature was going to be, how it got developed. It slowly developed over time. Another good example for this is George R. R. Martin with Game of Thrones. He started with initial ideas, but he's constantly changing, constantly adapting his story. He knows where it ends. He has some good fixed points, and everyone's going to need those. Those are the standards, right the end of your story before you get to the before you start writing everything else, and you write to the end. You kind of work your way to that point. But with this, it's very much about flexibility. It's less detail-oriented, though, so that's kind of the negative. You'll notice in Game of Thrones, there isn't a huge use of language. The Dothraki, for example, you get a few snippets of words and phrases, but for the most part, you're hearing English. You see English, or there's an implication of they describe what Dothraki sounds like, and that's how the Gartner Model works. It's not about the details. It's much more about you're relying much more on implication. But that can also lead to confusing or misunderstood concepts if you're not very careful. So it's the reason why George R. R. Martin takes forever. It's the explanation for the Great Bearded Glacier. You need time to create that consistency. And you can also create a whole bunch of author mistakes if you're not very careful and if you don't have a good editor. Because, when you're writing stories and constantly evolving things, the gray pony suddenly turns into a white pony in the second book, and no one can explain why. So, that's the Gartner Model. Let's go into the Architect Model. The architect creates detailed plans and models during the pre-writing phase, and they make sure to cross-reference their notes throughout the writing phase. When you saw my Google Drive, I had tables, charts, timelines down to the month and sometimes day. I've studied battle strategies, placement of troops, how languages evolve and develop. There's tons of research that go into the architect model. This is kind of the Tolkien model. Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings universe, the Silmarillion, all that. He started in 1917 in the trenches of the Somme. And the Silmarillion wasn't published until, I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was 1978 after his death. And he was consistently writing in that world. So, you know, there's a ton of cultural and narrative elements in the architect model. It will usually have elaborate religious doctrines, languages, wars, political structures. You'll have stories that will mention kings from 5,000 years ago. They only maybe get mentioned once. But to the writer, that was important because it helps to explain other concepts. This is also, there tends to be a very detailed writing voice. If you read the Silmarillion, it kind of reads like the Bible, a little bit. It kind of reads like a gospel. Actually, it kind of reads like the book of Genesis in a lot of ways. But with elves. The problem, there's a big negative with this. Writers can become bogged down in their own internal mythos. And you sometimes need motivation to actually put the tables and charts down and write something. Like, it is very easily, and it's also very easy to become defensive of your world. Oh, I don't want to share this with anybody. I've worked so much on this. I don't want I don't want anyone messing with this. And that's not the right, what you're going to end up with is no written work at all. So, what style suits me? Everyone world builds. Every writer, even non-high fantasy or low fantasy writers, world build. And you know, it's just because that's what you need to actually create the complex stories and to really develop the themes that your story should be about. So the world is supposed to aid the characters. So characters should always come first. It's okay. Got some heroic theme music. Alright, so when I thought about it, what kind of model would better suit you? If you desire when you write to really evoke emotion or simply ground a world, that's your intention behind world building, and the thematic details tend to fall by the wayside, it's not so much, you don't need to know every king of a nation, you need to know what that nation stands for, what its history is, like its general outline of history. Is it peaceful? Is it warlike? Is their language guttural? Does it have actions first? And maybe it doesn't really have proper nouns, stuff like that. Those are the things you really want to think about. Then the Gartner Model is really going to work for you. But if the details, if the thematic connections, if the personal narratives of small, minor characters are really crucial to your story, lean towards the architect model. And in truth, as long as you just start writing, you're going to find yourself leaning towards one way or the other. So even if you can't tell what you would be, if you start writing, you'll kind of naturally lean from one way to the other. So, you notice that in each of these there were pitfalls, negatives. How do we avoid those? In the Gartner Model, avoiding inconsistencies is honestly finding a world checker. You know, it's an editor whose entire purpose is to look over and check your narrative for world building issues. In Game of Thrones, for example, in the World of Ice and Fire book, if anyone's seen that, it's literally a bunch of fans that got together. The Brotherhood Without Banners is literally a fan group that gets together and helps George R. R. Martin cross-reference his stories because they know the world better than he does. So sharing your worlds with someone else can help you to keep yourself consistent, to make sure that you're not going to make an error in that regard. And as far as the architect model, It's, again, venting. Talk about your world. Don't keep it to yourself. Don't keep yourself, show your tables and charts to people. If you really, and what's more, they can also they can tell you, your friends will tell you, oh, that idea is awful. Don't use that. Or, that's amazing. You should definitely use that. Vent. Talk about your worlds to people, because they will help you to determine what's good, what's bad, and what's a wrong direction or the right direction. So, there's also a third strategy. This is what I call the Eric Flint model, or the open universe. Allow other writers to contribute. And, when I'm talking about the architect model, I've been working on that fan fiction for 4 years. And I've had to ask myself this on numerous occasions. How much is too much? Because world building is addicting. It's very easy to build and just keep building. You ask another question and another question, and suddenly you're realizing that you've mapped out 13,000 years of history.
By accident.
By accident. It literally was by accident. I just kept on asking questions, and in about 7 months, I had all those timelines, and I've honestly been trying to consolidate it a little bit. In addition, you will become possessive. I'll have some questions and comments right at the end. You will become possessive of your world. The longer you work in it, the less you're really going to want to share it with people, because maybe they're not going to appreciate it like you do, and you've built these characters. And especially if you're writing a dramatic story, you're going to start killing characters off, and I don't think my computer is plugged in. I don't think it's charging. I don't think so. Sorry, I just got a battery running low on my screen. So, where was I? What?
I see a brick hanging off the edge of the table. It doesn't look like it's an important brick.
That would be probably the problem. Yeah, now it's working. Okay. We fixed it.
Yay!
All right, so where was I? Possessive. Thank you. You're going to want to be you've created these characters. You're going to want to sometimes you've killed them off, and you're going to feel terrible, and you're not going to know how people are going to react to it. Jon Snow. So.
No, that's the thing. We get people attached to them and then kill them.
You get people attached to them, and then you kill them because you're a soulless, illegitimate child. Alright. Also, if you're writing a short story, like a one-shot or a 500-word thing, you don't need a vast mythology. Write what you need. You can ponder if you ponder a question repeatedly, though, as you're writing it, you're going, what is that? How did that come about? And you keep on asking that through the process, and you just can't get that out of your head. Answer it. That's perfectly fine to answer it. The question should be the things you can't help but question. That's really a good way to kind of focus where your question should be. If you keep on asking the same question, then it's time to answer it. So I mentioned the Eric Flint style. Eric Flint is a science fiction alternate history writer. His big claim to fame right now is the Ring of Fire series, which is, since the year 2000, every year about 3 books in the series come out. And the thing that's really big about it is that it's open universe. Eric Flint plays editor, but other authors and even fans can submit stories, and if he approves, they become part of the canon and expand the lore and the universe. So he is actually able to build this massive, complex universe totally independent of his own actions. And this is a really good model for creating a complex world without being afraid you're going to get bogged down in your own mythology. Because you're literally handing it over to other people. You're literally saying, here are my details, I am God, and I say, this is okay and this is not. This is canon and this is not canon. But you ultimately allow the freedom to actually, you liberate your work from yourself, which is sometimes the best thing you can do for a universe. And it really also forces you to trust people. You really do have to trust people with this method. If you don't trust people, or you're not sure about the quality of the work you're going to get, the Eric Flint style is probably not the style for you. So, we're approaching the end, and I wanted to kind of go into some basic considerations, topics you should think about when you're world building. In future TrotCons, I will probably introduce specific world building, so a whole subject on, timelines, on how do you develop a good political system? What makes sense in world building styles? And what patterns do you kind of see in that? That will be for the future. But right now, I'm going to focus on three things: timelines, language, and the beliefs and the antagonists of your world. So, timelines this is actually less of a narrative element and more of a pre-writing element. Timelines are really useful for consistency. You can create an event, creating a timeline for when certain events, both historical and narrative, occur, can help you to know where certain characters are. For example, if you're writing multiple stories that are all happening at the same time, it's a nice idea to know where a character is at a certain time, so that they don't end up popping up. It takes 3 weeks to get from town A to town B, and they're in both at the exact same time. How did that happen? No, having a time, okay, on May 4th, they're here. So if an event is occurring in town B at May 4th, they're not there, they're in the other town. It helps you to keep that kind of consistency, because some fans will notice that. Fans can be quite obsessive. For some reason, I'm having trouble actually focusing. No. Also, it can help you if you notice patterns. For example, if you notice when you're writing up when characters maybe were born or die, if you notice a lot of characters dying in the same year or in the same time or place, you can start to create events in your head around that, and that's helping you to create larger mythologies. Maybe a war happened, and that's why they all died. They all died in the war. Maybe a disease ravaged the place, and what effect does that have on the population where that disease hit? It starts to help you kind of create and pre-write new events and new story ideas. It's easiest generally to go by years, and then when necessary, go into months. There are some times where you might even have to go into days. The only time you generally have to go into days is if you're writing a war or battle sequences, because knowing specific times and places of, if you're really wanting to go into troop movements and where are armies and where battles are being held, it might be useful sometimes to know, days, weeks, heck, time of day. I actually, for my fan fiction, I actually studied the Battle of Gettysburg in order to understand how long it took a 19th century army to move around a battlefield, so that it would be more realistic if you actually had 19th century tech fighting. How would they move in a battlefield? You don't have to do that. Fantasy, you can do what you like. But I like some realism in my stories, and that can kind of make research rather interesting. But as I said, this kind of detail can be time-consuming. But even if you're not going into super detail, even a cursory timeline can help you in a lot of ways. It can help you just keep focused on when and where your story is. And as far as your story can go, literally the beginning of your story, the first chapter can be where you start your timeline, and where it ends is at the end of your timeline. You don't have to go 15 years into the future or 13,000 years into the future, or into the past or future. You don't have to do that sort of thing, unless you want to, or your story's a larger mythology. So, that's timeline. It's a fairly simple idea. Language. Usually when people think of world building, language tends to be the really famous one. You think of Tolkien, and you think of his elven languages. In fact, Tolkien designed the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings universe, to create a world for his languages. He was a linguist first, and created Lord of the Rings to explain where those languages came from and why they were used. And it's an excellent way of expanding the world, and it's a way to also think about cultures, because different cultures, especially isolated ones, will have different linguistic traditions and customs. They might have different turns of phrase. They might have, if they have a language, it would probably be an entirely different language family, because languages evolve over time. So the longer your timelines go, the more divergence you might have. If you have a culture in your timeline where there's a civil war and two nations are divided for a long period of time, they might start to develop linguistic and tonal changes and euphemisms that are totally unique to them. And so, when you're writing, that will affect how those characters in that culture might speak. For example, in a polytheistic society, wouldn't you say, "Oh my gods," instead of "Oh my God"? Because if you have more than one god, you would say multiples. So it's sort of thinking like that. Think about the linguistic traditions and how your culture affects your language. Also, it's the exact opposite. Isolated cultures tend to have very divergent languages, but very close cultures tend to have very similar languages, or even shared languages. Europe is a really good example. Spain, Italy, France, and Romania, ironically enough, have very similar language traditions. Their languages come from the same shared root, Latin, because they all used to be run by the same place, the Roman Empire. I'll have, again, questions and comments. We're almost done, actually. We only have a few more panels. So the questions we must go when you're creating a language: create, steal, or ignore. You can create your own unique language. There are actually amazing sites to create your own language. There is a language construction site. I think if you look up language construction, there's actually a site where you can join up, create your own languages, your own morphology, your own lexicon, grammar rules. It's really detailed and it's really cool. But language is, again, very time-consuming, and it's very difficult to create a logical, consistent language. And if you're having a vast mythology, creating language families, creating, specific dialects, you have to start thinking about that. So it might sometimes be easier to just use existing languages. Oh, these guys, a good way of thinking about it is the ponies of Prance speak French. When you write it, it's just French. So all you need to know is how to say a few words in French And that's them speaking a different language. And that's perfectly acceptable. That works. That's actually a really good way of doing it, because it will save you on fan fiction time and energy, because language can be draining to think about, especially if you're unfamiliar with language rules, language customs, and how language is developed. If you're not a linguist, creating languages can be very, very draining. Or you could just ignore it. The George R.R. Martin rule. Come up with a few phrases, a few words. They don't even have to make sense. Just come up with words and ideas and describe how the language sounds. Like evoke emotion with how they are speaking, but don't actually say what they are speaking. And that actually kind of brings us into the way to think about it is the speakers. Be aware of who is speaking at any one time. If your main character knows only one language and they hear someone speaking another language, write it in that person's language, or maybe just describe how that language sounds to them. But if you switch perspectives to the person who's speaking, they know how to speak that language. So you might want to italicize what they're speaking to indicate to the audience that they're not speaking English, but that to them, what they're hearing is still perfectly intelligible to them. So that's sort of the way you can get around it. It's always be aware of who is speaking at any one time. And it's important to think about language because you communicate to your audience when you're writing in a language. So how your characters communicate between themselves, inside their own head, and how that's portrayed to the audience will affect the quality of your writing. You know, if your character has a high educational mark, they're going to speak differently from someone who went to kindergarten and got kicked out. They're going to have two different ways of speaking, and that's going to affect how they tell the story in their perspectives, or how they will talk in the story. And so you as a writer have to be able to know that and understand that. So the other one is beliefs and antagonism. This was originally about religion. Not every story needs belief and ethical elements. In fact, most stories can be just fine without any of them. But I've always kind of noticed that the fact that religion and belief play such a huge role in human culture seems to imply that any world we would create should kind of share those as well, especially vast mythologies. You know, religion, and I think far more importantly, ethics, are something that don't need to be expanded upon in great detail, but they can really help you to develop an identity and a culture around the world. For example, is there a rite of passage amongst... Do ponies have a rite of passage? Yeah, that's their cutie marks. So how does that affect how they treat each other? How they talk with one another? How they treat, you know... What is on the job, like, what is job satisfaction when your job is literally painted on your rump? How does that play into things? How do you think, how is political ethics and political morality when you literally have an immortal goddess as your ruler? How does political ethics play into that? And so you have to kind of start thinking about that, but it's also the fact that religion, and especially religious politics, if you're going to start adding in religion, you have to add in politics. That can be an amazing way to add drama, to add, you know, conflict, because nothing stirs up conflict quite like religion.
True.
Sorry, I needed water. So, the ethics of a world can also help you to focus in on themes, because certain ethical beliefs will imply themselves to certain themes better. If your culture is really, really peaceful and pacifistic, did I say that right? Pacifistic? Yep. Okay, good. It's really early and I've been speaking for a long time. If you have a war story, how is that culture going to portray it? How is that culture going to affect your portrayal of a theme of war and violence and, you know, the things that tend to come with a story about war. So you got to think about that, and especially showing the relationship between the antagonistic force and the belief systems. Because really, when you're writing a story, if you have a belief system, generally your antagonist is either going to be in the predominant or against the predominant belief system of your world. So, you know, I kind of divided up into 3 models. We have the Lewis model from C.S. Lewis. The morality of the protagonist is societal. That is the predominant idea. Good guys win, bad guys lose. The antagonist is in opposition to the protagonist and society as a whole, and that idea, that predominant social idea, is absolutely superior and good. Tolkien's universe. The elves are good, the orcs are bad, and we know the orcs are absolutely, totally bad. There is no question on that one. You could also have the Orwellian model. The morality of the antagonist is the societal one. The predominant idea of the society is on the antagonist's side. Big Brother is running everything. And the protagonist is in opposition to that societal element, and it's the protagonist who has the superior ethical model, but they might not always win. It's superior, but it isn't always guaranteed to win, because the societal ethics tend to have more sway, especially in Orwell's work. And then there's also what I call the Hegelian model, after the philosopher Hegel. His basic idea was that all conflict is essentially the idea of you have a thesis and an antithesis, and the act of the two fighting each other is called synthesis, and it's basically a new idea. So you start with idea A, and then you have its exact opposite, which is constantly fighting against it. Idea B. And it's the act of the conflict between the two that, towards an end, a middle ground superior option, idea C, is developed. So say, for example, capitalism and communism are 2 opposing ideas, and it's the conflict between the two that create new ideas. I'm not going to say what those ideas are, because that's a whole other panel, a whole other set of ideas. But effectively, the idea for the Hegelian model would be the protagonist and the antagonist both have ideas, and either one could be societal, but the point of the story is that neither one is superior or good. It's the conflict between the two that forces a new idea to be developed. If anyone's seen The Legend of Korra,
yeah.
They are great at this, because you have Korra has one idea, society has one idea, the villains have another idea, and by the end of the season, neither one really wins. It's the middle ground that gets chosen. It's a new paradigm, and that's I tend to find is a much better model for how you develop ethics, because it's interesting and it's great to have the good guys win and the bad guys lose, and the good guys are clearly good guys. But it's much more interesting if you're not sure which idea is great, and especially if you notice in the predominant ideas of the society that there are flaws.
Like Watchmen.
Watchmen is a really good example as well. Like, the good guys have a legitimate point. No. Adobe. Alright, so. Oh, wait. What? Come on. Come on. What's going on? Ah! Thank you. So that is sort of it. Here's a brief summary if you guys want to kind of look at that. We're actually going to go into questions and comments. Does anybody have anything to say? All right. You actually were waiting the longest, then you, and then you. Yep.
So, I know you mentioned about open world writing, which allows fans of the authors to contribute to the writing of the story even after the first author, the main one, stopped. So, would you consider Model 20 franchise also something like this, which how the fans have to be so many OCs and turn back their multiple ones?
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm going to. Can I unmute this or? Okay. Actually, if you could hand this around to the various people, I'd like you to ask that question one more time. See if that answers.
So the question was, with how the My Little Pony franchise has evolved into a series which can have so many OCs and background characters becoming fully fledged ones, would you also consider it to be an open world writing scenario? And also, what kind of tips would you give to creating a type of series that could have something where other people will be able to participate in creating more unique works based around the franchise?
To answer your first question, the model of which most television shows are written already kind of follows an open world. It's the fact if you watch Doctor Who, if you watch My Little Pony, the main head writer only writes a couple of episodes in a season, and they'll usually trade it off to other writers. And so while they might be the head writer, and so the editor, as it was, the final say, these other writers are totally given the free range to write and come up with a concept in an episode, and the head writer might help. But in this open model, you have a supreme authority. You have the person who is the absolute final end-all be-all. Eric Flint still does write from time to time, but he is constantly being given things to say, okay, this story works, this story isn't. In fact, one of my favorite stories in the 1632 series, the Baltic War, is only half written by him. It is the best book, by the way. So, as far as you said, what do I think about the idea of, like, the credence to creating?
The second half of that question was, what tip would you give to making sure you have an open world that will allow people to have a lot of creativity? Because, like, while a lot of series will generally give the main character like a main superpower or something that most people don't, and therefore other characters, it doesn't make sense for other characters to be able to do anything too interesting in the world. So what tip would you give to somebody who wants to make a world where a lot of original characters along with main characters can be expanded upon, like in how My Little Pony does with fan fiction stuff?
What you need for that is a solid backbone. You need a good set narrative. Create a timeline for basic ideas that you know have to occur in the past. And leave space open. Don't come up with a background for every character that's ever shown up. And especially in fan fiction, it's a really good idea to also create basically almost a directory. In 1632, if you go to Eric Flint's site, there's actually a directory he has that basically explains who are all the characters. Because the basic idea behind Eric Flint's story is that a coal mining town in West Virginia gets sent back in time to 1631 Germany. So he had to establish, when he wrote that universe, how many people live in the town, who they are, what they do, and what technology they brought with them, so that you literally didn't have, oh, well, there was a jet airline that just so happened to be right above the town No, that's not going to happen. You set down very specific rules about what can and cannot show up in a world. And as far as fan fiction goes, I actually would like to turn the Equestrian Cycle, my fan fiction, into an open world. I would like people to be able to contribute into that, because some people have great ideas, and I really do think I need to throw my world out to other people just to get it away from me for a little bit.
Go outside for a little bit and then come back in an hour, see what went wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as fan fictions go, if you create like a group on film fiction, for example, you can create folders that are, say, main story, side stories, canon, side stories, non-canon, stuff like that. And so you can divide what is non-canon and canon, and you can choose as you're reading them, looking them over. If somebody sends you something, you can kind of, if you make this alteration here, 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 and here, it could be canon. It would totally work. You work with people to make sure that your world has a consistency and that it still kind of goes into a vision that everyone can enjoy, but more importantly, one that you feel comfortable with. It is your world, and you, first and foremost, should feel comfortable in it. So, next question? Right here.
So, on the topic of really good world builders, do any of you guys know Stephen Baxter with his Zeely sequence?
Not at all.
I'd say, it's interesting in that it's not very character-based at all, but it has some of the most amazing world building and timeline stuff I've ever seen. Like, he maps it from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe and everything that happens. It's science fiction. It's really, really good.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also a great way for, if you're wanting to do real big, thick, heavy world building, is start from the very beginning and move your way forward. Or in what I ended up doing, kind of, start at the story, where the point your story goes, you ask questions of where the origin came from, and then you fill in the middle. And you'll usually tend to find some things. And you had a question as well, I believe.
Yes, I do, actually.
She's bringing the...
Thank you. So, a lot of people, a lot of writers will often reference each other when they're talking about craft. But I've noticed you haven't done that today, and I wanted to ask, did you pull more from George R. R. Martin's master class or from Brandon Sanderson's Write About Dragons lecture studies?
I actually haven't seen either of those. This is just my experience. I am actually a professionally trained film critic. I went to school for film criticism. A lot of what I've developed as far as world building and narrative writing came from how I was taught to examine film and how it portrays and examines things. So when I write, I tend to also visualize a lot of what I see, a lot of what I write as well. I'm a very visual heavy guy. So as far as the writing master classes, I really haven't looked at any of those. This is more of just sort of my own thoughts, having read a ton of fan fiction and knowing what works in world building and what doesn't, and what I like in world building, because I'm a big alternative history guy.
The architects and gardeners comparison is definitely a George R. R. Martin quote.
I think I did take that from him somewhere, but it wasn't... I think I did actually, I remember him saying that, but I didn't know where it was from. I wasn't able to... I just remember hearing him in an interview once saying it.
Yeah, it's the masterclass interview. It's on YouTube. It's like an hour and a half long.
That would probably be where it is.
Several of your points came either from the master class that he taught or Brandon Sanderson's classes, both of which are on YouTube, and you followed them fairly point for point for about half of the lecture. Maybe it's coincidence. It seems a bit odd to me, and I was wondering why you weren't referring to them at all.
I honestly didn't know. This is just what seemed to make sense to... I honestly wrote this I finished this up about a month ago, and I haven't looked at it since because I was working on the other two panels. I kind of just wrote what seemed to make sense to me. I had no... she can attest, I had no plan, I had no...
It makes sense that you would have some pull from classical, from more classical ideas and a lot of other people's ideas because he has been trained and he may have been pulling from.
I mean, there are a lot of similarities, so, I just had to ask. That's all.
Yeah, no, it's totally a coincidence, and that happens to me. I'm really good at remembering details, just not the ones that matter, like where my ideas come from.
Then if you don't mind, did you publish the Equestrian Cycle on Film Fiction by any chance?
Not yet. I am still working on. I wrote an initial story, and on my Film Fiction account, which is Jacob Fox, if you look up Jacob Fox on there, which is a pen name I go under. I have a basic outline of the stories I'm currently working on and the ideas I sort of have. It is eventually, I am actually having a goal of creating a Equestrian Cycle full, group that might be able to help contribute to ideas.
All right, thank you.
Yep. And we have about 2 minutes, so you're going to be the, actually, if you had a question, you can talk with me right after. I'll be glad to ask a question. I want to get someone who hadn't asked a question yet. So right up here in the blue shirt.
Hello, I would like to ask you, where would you prioritize world building when creating a story in comparison to fleshing out characters and building a theme or strengthening and building a plot?
Plot. Conflict. You have to have, you can create characters and you can have a basic idea of what your characters are, but it's far, far more important that you have something for your characters to do. You can outline, you can detail more after you know what the conflict is, because a conflict is supposed to change your characters. So your character is going to change throughout the story. So it's probably a better idea to just have what happens to them be the first thing you think about. And usually when you think of an idea, one of the stories in the cycle I came up with was originally a changeling war story, an anti-war story that developed because I happened to read about, a thing going on between China and North Korea and the United States, and I suddenly had this great idea for a story. And it just started. I had the idea for the conflict, and then I developed the characters. I didn't even have names. I had nothing. I just had an idea. What event took place, and that's the way to really go about it. And that actually about wraps it up. I want to thank you guys for coming into my very last panel. We are actually, I think they're getting ready to set up for the charity auction. Not yet? Okay.
I'm not familiar.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right, so thank you guys. And if you guys have any more questions, I have my business cards up here. You guys can see me on YouTube and on Twitter at the Brony Critic.
It's like